I watched my husband collapse on our living room floor. I called for help. I believed they'd come rushing in to save him. But they didn't. They stood there, 10 feet away, frozen. Because a woman with a clipboard told them they couldn't cross my damn lawn. I begged. I screamed. I thought if I screamed loud enough, maybe God himself would push them through that door. But while Garrett gasped for air, she stood there quoting bylaws, and by the time they finally pushed past her, it was too late. You think that's the end of the story? No. That was just the beginning. Stick around. You need to hear what happened next. The morning sun baked the sidewalk, casting long, sharp shadows across Willow Ridge Estates. Garrett Bennett knelt by the fence he'd been working on all week, a hammer tucked into his belt, a smear of white paint on his temple he hadn't noticed yet. "Think the roses will finally survive this year?" he called, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. I laughed from the porch. "If Agnes Thorn doesn't find a reason to find them first." Garrett grinned, that easy, lopsided smile that made you believe things would be all right. "Let her try." Garrett was the kind of man you don't meet twice in a lifetime. Tall, broad-shouldered, with calloused hands from years of fixing things himself. His hair was peppered with gray, but his blue eyes still carried the easy warmth of a man who saw the best in people. He wasn't some big-shot executive or polished politician. Garrett was a high school shop teacher, proud of every callus and splinter he'd earned. He built birdhouses with kids on weekends, volunteered at Little League games even when our son aged out, and spent Sundays repairing broken fences for neighbors who couldn't afford a handyman. Born and raised in a small town, Garrett was the son of a mechanic and a school librarian. Right after high school, he joined the Navy, served 6 years, and came home to marry me, his high school sweetheart. Garrett believed in simple things: family, hard work, doing the right thing even when no one was watching. He believed in rules, but the kind that protected people, not punished them. Kindness, honesty, community. Agnes Thorn believed in rules too, but not the same kind. She stood at the far end of the sidewalk now, squinting at Garrett's work like a general surveying enemy territory. Mid-50s, sharp-edged features carved into permanent disapproval. Her coral lipstick looked like it had been applied with a ruler. Pearl earrings glinted like tiny flashbulbs whenever she moved her head. She wore a tailored navy pantsuit, even though it was nearing 90 degrees out, and clutched her clipboard like a weapon. Agnes didn't just walk, she marched. Her heels clicked down the concrete like a slow, steady metronome of judgment. Every step seemed designed to announce, "I am in charge." Her icy blue eyes scanned the world not with curiosity, but with suspicion, always looking, always evaluating, always preparing to pounce. We'd seen her before, watching from behind her curtains, taking notes, waiting. Garrett and I had done everything right, paid our HOA dues, kept the lawn trimmed, repainted the mailbox when the letter said it didn't fit the community aesthetic. But in Willow Ridge Estates, ruled by Agnes Thorn, all it took was one mistake to become a target. And ours. It was a fence. It started on that Wednesday afternoon. Garrett had been planning the fence extension for months. Just a few extra feet, enough to protect the rose bushes he'd planted last spring from the brutal summer winds. "It's still within our lot," he said, holding up the survey papers with pride. I measured twice. He wasn't a man to cut corners. Every nail, every board had been perfectly lined up. By Saturday, it was finished. The new section blended so seamlessly with the original that you wouldn't know it hadn't been there all along. We barely had time to admire it when we heard the sound. The rapid-fire click of high heels against concrete. Agnes Thorn, clipboard in hand, marching across our lawn like she owned it. Garrett stood and wiped his hands on his jeans, ever the respectful neighbor. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Thorn. Beautiful day, isn't it?" She didn't return the smile, didn't even glance at the roses nodding gently in the breeze. "Mr. Bennett," she said crisply, "I need to speak with you." There was a pause, heavy, like the air itself braced for impact. "Of course," Garrett said, calm and polite as always. Agnes consulted her clipboard with the gravity of a Supreme Court judge. Your new fence extension is in violation of community guidelines. Section 12A, all external structures require prior approval. Garrett frowned slightly. But it's inside our property line. Approval is required regardless, she snapped, her voice as cold as her stare. You didn't submit the necessary forms. Therefore, the structure is unauthorized. Ma'am, Garrett said carefully, I'm happy to fill out whatever paperwork you need. But the fence isn't bothering anyone. It's not blocking any views. It's not against any municipal code. Agnes's lips twitched, almost into a smirk. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. People like you think the rules don't apply. But they do. And I will make sure they do. Garrett's jaw tightened. His knuckles whitened around the hammer still tucked into his belt. For a heartbeat, I thought he might say something, fight back. But he only nodded stiffly. Have a nice day, Mrs. Thorn. Agnes turned sharply on her heel. You'll be receiving a violation notice, she called back, her voice sharp and clipped. Failure to comply within 30 days will result in daily fines. The clipboard snapped under her arm with the finality of a slammed prison door. And just like that, we were no longer neighbors. We were enemies. The worst part? As she walked away, I caught a glimpse of it, the faint, smug gleam in her eye. This wasn't about offense. It was about power. And we hadn't even seen what she was really capable of yet. You think you're prepared when someone targets you. You think you'll see it coming. We didn't. The first violation notice came 2 days later, taped to our front door in bright red ink. Notice of non-compliance, unauthorized structure, immediate action required. But it wasn't just about the fence anymore. They listed everything they could think of. An unapproved color of the front door wreath. A garden hose, visible from the street. Trash cans left out too early, even though Garrett brought them out the night before, like everyone else. Each infraction came with a fine. $50 here, $75 there. $25 per day, until corrected. Garrett stood there on the porch, reading the paper silently. His hand trembled slightly at the edges. Across the street, through the half-closed blinds, Agnes Thorn was watching, smiling. The harassment escalated fast. One morning, we found deep scratches keyed along the side of Garrett's pickup. No note, no witnesses. Later, anonymous complaints about noise disturbances, though we hadn't had a party in years, flooded the HOA. The next morning, the rose bushes Garrett loved were uprooted, torn from the soil like they never mattered. That afternoon, another violation notice. Yard unsightly, garden in disrepair. Neighbors who used to wave crossed the street when they saw us. Lawn services canceled without warning. Children were ushered indoors when we stepped outside. We weren't just being fined, we were being erased. Every day brought a new attack. Every evening, Garrett fought back quietly, patching, cleaning, fixing, as if he could mend our life with enough elbow grease. One night before the HOA meeting, I found him at the kitchen table, polishing his old Navy ring. His hands were steady, but his eyes were tired. You don't run from bullies, he said softly. Not then, not now. I squeezed his hand. I prayed he was right. Then came the meeting. Willow Ridge Estates, emergency HOA session, mandatory attendance. The clubhouse smelled like burnt coffee and cheap carpet. Folding chairs creaked under the weight of people too scared to meet our eyes. The air felt sticky, charged. Agnes Thorn stood at the front, clipboard in hand, eyes gleaming. The purpose of tonight's meeting, she said, is to address ongoing compliance issues threatening the harmony of our community. She didn't say our names. She didn't have to. Slide after slide flashed on the projector screen. Our fence. Our garden hose. Our trash cans. Every image framed like a crime scene. I caught Mrs. Duval's eye, our old neighbor, and for a moment she looked like she might speak up. She didn't. Fear had its own gravity. A pattern of disregard, Agnes droned. A blatant refusal to respect community standards. The room sat frozen. Garrett stood slowly, not hurried, not loud. "With all due respect," he said, voice carrying across the room, "this isn't about fences or hoses. It's about control." You could hear a pin drop. "This board isn't protecting Willow Ridge," Garrett continued. "It's using rules like weapons, against people who dare to plant roses without permission." A few heads nodded, tiny, almost imperceptible acts of rebellion. For a heartbeat, I thought, maybe they'll remember who we are. But then Agnes slammed her clipboard onto the podium. The sound cracked through the room. "Motion to fine the Bennetts $500 for continued non-compliance." Hands rose immediately, not with enthusiasm, with fear, like marionettes on invisible strings. We were outvoted. Again. Still, Garrett turned to me, squeezed my hand with a look that said, "We're not giving up." As we gathered our things to leave, I glanced back one last time. And there, in the corner of the room, I saw it. Mrs. Duval, sweet, smiling Mrs. Duval, quietly handing Agnes a folder. "Our violation records, detailed, annotated." My stomach turned. Betrayal wasn't loud. It was silent, cold. We hadn't just been outvoted, we'd been sold out. And somewhere across the street, behind a twitching curtain, Agnes Thorn was already planning her next move. One that would cost far more than money. One that would cost everything. It happened on a Sunday, the kind of warm, lazy afternoon Garrett loved best. I was in the kitchen brewing coffee, humming along to an old Eagles song Garrett had stuck in my head. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass panel by the front door, throwing purples and golds across the tile floor like a church window. Garrett was laughing about something he saw in the paper. He glanced up at me and smiled. "Coffee smells good today," he said. That was the last thing he ever said to me. A thud. Heavy. Final. The mug slipped from my hand, shattering on the tile. For a split second, everything slowed. The shards of ceramic spun through the air like frozen rain. The clock ticked, louder than a gunshot. Coffee bled across the floor in dark, creeping tendrils. I turned and saw him collapsed on the living room floor. His body was wrong, twisted, stiff. His breathing was shallow, barely more than a whisper. "Garrett!" I screamed, dropping to my knees. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. His hand twitched toward me, a desperate, tiny motion, and then stillness. My fingers fumbled across my phone. I dialed 911 with shaking hands. "My husband! He's collapsed! He's not breathing right! Please, just hurry!" The dispatcher's voice was calm, too calm. "Help is on the way. Stay with him." And I believed her, because that's what you're supposed to believe in America, that when you call for help, it comes. I heard the sirens less than 5 minutes later. I flung the front door open so hard it banged against the wall. "He's inside! Hurry!" But they didn't move. 2 paramedics stood frozen at the edge of the walkway, bags in hand, faces torn between duty and fear. One of them, a younger man with dark hair, Miller I would learn later, shifted forward, stepping off the curb. Then he hesitated. Because standing between them and my front door was Agnes Thorn. Clipboard raised like a weapon. Her voice was sharp, slicing through the hot afternoon air. "Bylaw 18D. Unauthorized personnel are prohibited from entry during an open dispute." "He's dying!" I shrieked. "That's my husband!" Miller's partner, a woman with tightly braided hair, hissed under her breath. "If we cross, they can sue us." Miller clenched his jaw. "If we don't, he dies." Agnes didn't flinch. "You enter that property without authorization and you're trespassing." Inside, Garrett gasped, struggling for breath. Seconds stretched, cruel and endless. Agnes pulled out her phone, barking into it. "Yes, I need law enforcement. Unauthorized entry." She was calling the police, as my husband lay dying. I didn't think. I acted. I charged down the steps, grabbing Miller's arm. "You're coming with me," I snapped, shaking him. "Sue me later. Help him now." Miller stared at me for half a second longer. Then he said, "Screw this." He pushed past Agnes. His partner followed. Agnes screeched louder, but her voice blurred into background noise. They dropped to their knees beside Garrett. Oxygen masks, chest compressions. Commands barked with brutal urgency. But under it all, a single, sickening question pounded in my head. How much time had we already lost? They fought for him. They fought so hard. But deep down, I knew. When Miller finally looked up, the pity in his eyes said it before his mouth could. Garrett was gone. Not because they didn't care, not because they weren't fast enough, but because someone with a clipboard and a thirst for control decided a bylaw mattered more than a human life. Agnes Thorn stood at the curb, arms crossed, expression blank. The sun kept shining, birds kept singing, and Garrett stopped. I wanted to scream, to smash every window, to tear down every smug, heartless rule they had ever written. Instead, I collapsed onto the front steps, empty, broken, but not beaten, because sitting there watching the light fade from the world I knew, a new fire lit inside me. This wasn't over. Garrett died within 10 feet of help, and that's where our war began. 3 days later, while sorting through Garrett's paperwork, I found it. A letter from his cardiologist, dated 2 weeks before he collapsed. A formal request sent directly to the Willow Ridge Estates HOA asking that emergency personnel be given unrestricted access to our property due to Garrett's heart condition. Agnes had received it and ignored it. She knew. She knew he was vulnerable, and she chose to do nothing. The fire inside me burned hotter. This wasn't negligence. It was cruelty. Premeditated, and it would cost her everything. Grief doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It seeps in, cold and quiet. The first morning without Garrett, the house was too still. No clinking of spoons against coffee mugs, no humming from the bathroom, no exasperated, "Where did I put my keys?" floating down the hall. Just silence. And in that silence, something darker grew. Not just grief. Rage. The letter from Garrett's cardiologist sat on the table, a silent accusation. Agnes Thorn had known. She had been warned, and she chose to let him die anyway. On the fridge, held up by a faded magnet, was a sticky note Garrett had left the week before. Do the right thing. Always. I traced the handwriting with my fingertips. I wasn't going to let her bury that truth under paperwork and fake smiles. She took my husband. I would take everything she built. Arthur Davis knocked on my door 3 days after the funeral. Our neighbor, retired attorney. Quiet man, always wore plaid and carried a battered leather briefcase like it was stitched to his hand. "I saw what happened," he said simply. His voice cracked. "And if you're ready to fight, Eleanor, I'll help. Pro bono." I didn't answer right away. I just looked down at the sticky note still clutched in my hand, Garrett's last silent instruction. Finally, I nodded. Let's fight. That night, tucked under my door, was a different kind of note. Plain white paper. All it said was, "Drop the case or face the consequences." No signature, no name, only fear. I folded it carefully and tucked it beside Garrett's sticky note. One was a threat. The other was a promise. And I knew which one I was going to honor. We started small, filing a wrongful death lawsuit, gathering evidence, witness statements. Arthur worked like a man possessed. Every HOA bylaw, every meeting minute, every internal email we could legally request, he unearthed them all. And the deeper we dug, the worse it got. Buried in the HOA's digital archives was a memo, written by Agnes herself, stating that access to non-compliant properties was to be denied to all third-party personnel, including emergency services, unless personally approved by the HOA president. There it was, in black and white, premeditated cruelty, and it had Garrett's blood on it. The day we filed the lawsuit, it didn't feel triumphant. It felt like stepping onto a battlefield. Within a week, the HOA responded with walls of polished lawyers and cold, impersonal letters. Motion to dismiss, motion to delay, motion to intimidate. Neighbors began whispering. Some left anonymous notes of support on my porch. Others turned their faces away. One morning, I found a black rose in my mailbox, a silent, chilling warning. Arthur just smiled grimly. They think hiding behind titles and fine print will protect them. It won't. Not from the truth. Not from you? I didn't care what names they called me. They could call me a storm. Because a storm was coming. I had Garrett's truth, and I had the fire he left behind. Sometimes, walking to the store or watering the roses that somehow still grew, I would catch Agnes Thorn watching me from her porch. One afternoon, as I collected mail from the crooked box, she called across the street, voice dripping with false sweetness. "My deepest sympathies, Eleanor. But rules are rules." She smiled, as if she hadn't killed him, as if she was still untouchable. She wasn't. Not anymore. 2 months later, the real break came. Arthur called me late one night, voice taut with excitement. "The paramedics filed an incident report," he said. "They put it all on record." Everything? Everything. Their report detailed how Agnes blocked access, invoked bylaws during a medical emergency, and delayed treatment. The district attorney picked up the case, criminal charges, not just civil. They were investigating Agnes Thorn for involuntary manslaughter. My hands shook as I held the phone, not from fear, from hope, real hope. Agnes thought the worst was behind her. She didn't realize. We were just getting started. Grief doesn't make you weak. It makes you unstoppable. For the first time since Garrett collapsed on our living room floor, I believed that maybe, just maybe, there would be justice. The courthouse smelled like stale coffee and old paper. I used to think trials were glamorous, objections, shouting, last-minute confessions. The truth is, it's cold, it's slow, it's agonizing. The day the trial began, I wore black. Not for show, not for sympathy. I was still mourning. Not just Garrett. I was mourning what trust used to feel like. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the benches. Neighbors crammed into the back rows, pretending they weren't craning their necks. And there, at the defense table, sat Agnes Thorn. Hair pinned back tight, navy blazer, expression blank, the same passive-aggressive calm she'd worn the day my husband died. She wouldn't look at me. Maybe she thought I'd cry. Maybe she hoped I would. I didn't. I came for the truth. Arthur opened the case with a timeline. Calm. Relentless. He walked the jury through everything. The 911 call. The paramedics frozen on the walkway. The bylaw Agnes screamed about while Garrett gasped for air. The memo. The cardiologist's letter she ignored. The room went so still you could hear pens scratching. Then came the witnesses. Miller, the paramedic, took the stand first. He spoke slowly, voice steady, jaw tight. "We were informed we would be trespassing if we entered. I explained it was a cardiac emergency. Mrs. Thorn said it didn't matter." A murmur ran through the court. Then came his partner, Chan, softer, but just as clear. "We tried to cross. We hesitated because Mrs. Thorn threatened to report us to the licensing board." The jurors leaned forward. You could feel it, the slow, heavy turning of opinion. When it was my turn, I stood. I took the oath, and I told them everything. About Garrett, his roses, his silly off-key singing, and about the morning he died while bureaucracy strangled our front porch. I described watching the color drain from his face while Agnes Thorn clutched a piece of paper like it mattered more than his life. And then Arthur held up the memo, projected it onto a giant screen. The courtroom gasped. You could hear Agnes's lawyer shift uncomfortably. Arthur read aloud. "Access to emergency services shall be restricted unless approved by the HOA president." And the room cracked wide open. Finally, it was Agnes's turn. She took the stand. At first, she was rehearsed, professional, calm. There was confusion. I was following procedure. I didn't understand the urgency. Arthur leaned in. You received the cardiologist's letter, did you not? I may have. He pulled it out. Is this your signature, acknowledging receipt? Agnes's mask slipped. A bead of sweat rolled down her temple. Yes, she whispered. Arthur paused, letting the weight of that word fill the room. So you knew Mr. Bennett was vulnerable, and still enforced by Law 18D. We have rules for a reason, she snapped, voice cracking. And then she said the thing that sealed her fate. People like them always think they're above the rules. The courtroom went still. Every juror's face hardened. Agnes realized too late. She hadn't protected herself. She'd revealed herself. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood, voice steady. In the matter of the state versus Agnes Thorn, we find the defendant guilty of involuntary manslaughter. In the civil case, we find for the plaintiff, Eleanor Bennett. We award punitive damages in the amount of $2.5 million. I sat there, hands trembling in my lap, not from triumph, from relief, from finality. Garrett was still gone. No verdict could bring him back. But now, there was a record, a truth carved into history. No more hiding, no more lying. Justice. Outside, the courthouse steps were a frenzy of reporters and flashing cameras. Mrs. Bennett, do you feel justice was served? What would you say to other HOA boards across America? I looked into the sea of microphones and said, no rule is more important than a life, and no power is so sacred it can stand above humanity. Then I turned and walked away. Not victorious, not celebrating, just surviving. Because some victories you don't dance over. You just carry them forward and make sure no one ever forgets.